Hello, everyone. We'll be starting in a few seconds. Hi, everyone. My name is Ireri Hernandez, and today I will be facilitating this Adjust webinar. The webinar will take 1 hour. We'll leave the first 40 to 45 minutes to Zoi to present. So the speaker of today is Zoi Vrontisi from E3 Modeling. And Zoi is the director of the economic analysis team at BC3, where she has more than 15 years of experience doing model-based assessment of climate and energy policies. And the title of her work today that she'll be presenting is Uneven Ground, EU Regions at Risk in the Low Carbon Transition. Okay. Sorry, can you see the next slide? Yep. Wait, do you see? Okay. So Adjust is a project funded by the European Union's Horizon program and is carried out by a transdisciplinary European consortium consisting of 9 EU partners. 2 of them are in the UK and the other 11 associated partners. And Adjust is an acronym for Advancing the Understanding of Challenges, Policy Options, and Measures to Achieve a Just EU Energy Transition. And their objectives are to achieve a step challenge in understanding the distributed repercussions of the transition to climate neutrality, and also to identify effective and actively supported policy interventions so that no one is left behind. And with that, I will give the floor to Zoi.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ireri. So thank you all for joining. As I said, I'm Zoi Vrontisi. I'm the director of the economic analysis team here in E3 Modeling in Athens. And I will present 2 strands of work that actually relate to understanding the regional implications of the low carbon transition with different methodological approaches. Let me just share my presentation. So, yeah, you should see it in presenters mode now. Okay. So these 2 strands of work, one has been published already and the other is under review. So starting with the development of a static risk index that we performed in order to understand what are the EU regions at socio-economic risk of the low carbon transition. This has been published at the beginning of this year to Energy and Climate Journal. And it really considers the risk approach that has been developed by the IPCC. This risk approach has been mainly implemented for the physical risk analysis of climate change, so not for the transition risk. Here we implement this for the transition risk, and it considers the different components of risk as hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. In our case, we wanted to apply this methodology not for the physical risks as is the norm, but rather for the low carbon transition and how this entails risk for certain regions. And for this, we assume hazard as the change of domestic production in 2050 from 2015 levels for the fossil fuel-related sectors. So we assume that this is the main shock to the system. The exposure of the system is the share of employment in fossil fuel-related sectors compared to total employment. And then we have a number of indicators that then can consist of the vulnerability, thinking of the different elements of sensitivity and how the system can be described as sensitive, considering unemployment rate, GDP per capita, and income per capita, while the adaptive capacity can be described by investments per capita, regional competitiveness index, and the population beyond 50 years old. All this has been backed from literature review, but the main idea here is to develop a socioeconomic risk index that can actually describe, without having too much dynamic elements, what is the risk or the challenges that these regions already face because of what is expected to be seen in the fossil fuel sectors, and primarily with regards to job losses and the exposure of employment. Now we start with a number of data sources, Eurostat, the SPS database, JSE databases at the regional level. We also use model-based projections to understand for each specific country what is the change of domestic production of fossil fuels in time. And we then perform some data processing to fill gaps on employment data for the NUTS2 region and run different combinations of weights for these sub-indicators so as to understand how the different stakeholders would assess and conceive the importance of the adaptive capacity or the sensitivity and exposure and hazard in composing this socioeconomic risk index. Now we see that there is a strong divergence in risk profiles across EU regions. In essence, 74% of all EU regions do not appear in the top 20 positions in risk in all the weight combinations, in all 2,400 weight combinations that we have performed. On the other hand, only 6% of the EU regions are found in the top 20 positions. And this means that these have a high probability of risk. So we isolate these 15 regions that are on the top 5 position in all weight combinations. And we see that some of these 15 regions are come first in terms of risk in all weight combinations. So this is the case of Western Macedonia, where you see here in the lower graph with orange, it indicates the number of times in our runs that Western Macedonia is described with the highest risk index, but also the rest of the regions in top positions, like Silesia, Yugoslav and the Peloponnese are also found to be in the top risk positions in all weight combinations. So we understand that this provides some robustness to our assessment and the results, and indicates also the very uneven ground that the EU regions are faced with. Now, in terms of the determinants, we understand that the key determinant is indeed exposure, so the share of energy jobs and energy, especially with the fossil fuel sector, in total jobs, which indicates this low diversification, low economic diversification in the regions. And although hazard is equally high in all 15 regions, so there is a transformation to low carbon production in all of these regions. We see that in reality there are a few regions that actually have very high vulnerability due to their high exposure, but also high vulnerability in terms of high unemployment rate, low diversification of the economy, and low adaptive capacity in terms of the regional attractiveness index and the aging population. All these add to the challenge that the regions are facing, and we see that indeed vulnerability is particularly high in some of these regions. So when looking at these regions and comparing them to the average EU, we see indeed that Western Macedonia, that comes first in terms of risk, has a very high exposure, but also high vulnerability because of the very high unemployment rate that the region sees. It's among the highest in Europe. And through that, we see that a number of pre-existing socioeconomic challenges will add to the vulnerability of the regions when it comes to the low carbon transition. We have provided our data to the Energy and Industry Geography Lab of JRC, so you can find this online. And we aim to provide the data also for the next presentation, for the next research method that I will present now, which refers to a model-based assessment of the socioeconomic impacts of the EU climate neutrality pathways and the effectiveness of the Just Transition Fund. So here we do an ex-ante model-based impact assessment of the net zero target, and also assess a scenario for the Just Transition Fund and its effectiveness. We do this with the GEMI3 model, which is a large-scale, sophisticated economic model that has been employed the last 30 years by international institutions like the OECD, the World Bank, the European Commission, and has been providing scenarios to the IPCC. This is a large-scale computable general equilibrium model that captures the complex energy, economy, and climate interactions, taking into consideration both climate damages, but also the impact of climate and energy policies. Now, the model has a good sectoral representation with 68 economic activities and a good regional representation. And our main, let's say, focus of analysis is usually the climate transition, physical risks, assessing climate and energy and transport policies, understanding the cost of climate change and adaptation, but also have expanded to circular industrial policies, value chain analysis, investment strategies, and trade policies. The model has a good representation also at the regional level, so it represents the G20 countries and the EU27 member states, and all the regions are interlinked via bilateral trade. All the economic activities are interlinked via value chains, and then the 4 different economic agents, so households, firms, and government, and the international sector are interlinked via institutional transfers, all within the general equilibrium framework of GEMI3. And the model has a quite detailed representation of the energy system, but also of the greenhouse gas emissions that allows us to assess the implications of the low carbon transformation. And it also represents explicitly the clean energy manufacturing sectors, such as the manufacturing of PV module, wind turbines, electric vehicles, batteries, hydrogen, so as to understand what are the implications of the transition to these emerging sectors when leaving the fossil fuel production. We also feature a sub-national module, so the GEMI3 regional downscaling, which decomposes the national GEMI3 model outputs at the regional level for the EU, so for the NUTS2 level, and really considers the GEMI3 model outputs, such as GDP, employment, labor force, at the national level, to then provide this at the regional level. And the starting point is, first of all, the population and labor force by skill type, where we use Eurostat data to understand what is the labor force and the population at the NUTS2 level. But we also have a number of other data that allows us to use this dynamic approach with the regional attractiveness index to be able to downscale the national level employment and output at the regional level. And for this, we take into consideration also regional specificities, for example, natural endowments of the regions, so fossil fuel reserves or mineral ores, infrastructure facilities of the regions, manufacturing, especially when it comes to carbon-intensive sectors or emerging industries, but also when it comes to power supply, a regional representation of power plants, battery plants, renewable potential, and renewable installed capacities. So at the national level, we use the GEMI3 wages by skill type, the capital profitability and unemployment rate by skill type, that are actually also drivers at the regional level, and add the dynamic element to the regional attractiveness index, and added to this to the regional database that I described before, which includes all the infrastructural, power supply related and industry related data, along with the population and the labor force. We can then perform our regional analysis. So the scenarios that I will present here are based on top of a reference scenario. This reference scenario describes really the current trends in terms of socioeconomic and demographic projections, taking stock of exogenous projections for GDP and population growth. And it also considers, the reference scenario considers climate and energy policies that are described in the European Commission reference scenario as of 2020, so not including the latest Fit for 55, NDC and net zero targets, but rather starting at less ambitious scenario, on top of which we can add our net zero scenario. So we then assess the net zero scenario and the net zero with just transition funds. Looking in more detail at the just transition funds and what we assume in the scenario, this has been based on a detailed desk research that allowed us to understand the magnitude of the just transition funds, but also the type of measures that are expected for each of the member states. We see that in terms of, as a share of GDP, the just transition funds are quite diverse in intensity across the different EU regions, with regions with countries like Greece, and in particular, again, Western Macedonia, indicating the highest share in terms of the domestic value added, so the GDP of the Just Transition Fund, so it's more than 5% of the domestic production. But of course, in terms of in absolute levels, we see that countries like Germany are receiving the highest funds. When assessing this at the by the types of measures, we see that a lot of the countries have focused, and a lot of the regions really have focused on just transition funds that are relevant to the increase of entrepreneurship. And some are also focusing on the just transition of the workforce, while less so on energy transition and the technical capacity and other types of actions by the Just Transition Fund. Now, this has an important implication in our scenario, given that we consider that each of these types of measures generates different demand, different sectoral demand. So in essence, each of these types of measures translated into more detailed policy measures that generate economic demand, either at the domestic, so at the regional level, or imported, and this affects the macroeconomic implications of the Just Transition Fund. Now, starting looking at the EU 27 as a whole, we assess both the net zero here and the net zero Just Transition Fund scenarios, and we present the gross domestic product, investment, public and private consumption, exports and imports as a change, as a persistent change from a reference level. We see that this technology-intensive process of decarbonization leads to lower operational costs, but to higher demand for capital, primarily for the new investments that need to take place, but also, for example, power supply that is decarbonized is more capital intensive and less so based on OPEX. So we see less expenditure on fossil fuel, of course, which has a beneficial effect in terms of imports. So imports drop significantly because of lower demand of fossil fuels. But at the same time, there are a number of goods that need to be imported at the EU, national and regional level. And for example, PV modules, electric vehicles, etc., that are not primarily produced in the EU. Nevertheless, at the longer term, we see that the EU's GDP is marginally positive, and this is primarily due to the assumption on how the investments are financed. So we assume that these additional investments do not crowd out existing investments, but rather are financed cheaply via external loans that are repaid after 2050. This is based on the assumption that the low carbon transition financing will be facilitated through some enabling conditions that come along with the policy implementation, and this allows then some macroeconomic benefits to manifest, particularly when it comes to additional investments that add to the productive capacity of the economies. However, in the short to medium period, up to 2035, we see that the impacts on GDP are negative due to competitiveness losses. So we see exports are falling from the increasing production cost of carbon-intensive export-oriented industries. Still, there are some employment gains throughout the projected period due to high labor intensity of the new emerging sectors, but also the domestic content of these investment-related sectors, such as construction and other services. So, in essence, especially in the short to medium term, the transition to low-carbon economy requires a number of investments that involve the delivery of construction services and market services that are labor intensive. Now we're looking at the member state level. We see again that the macroeconomic impacts depend on a number of drivers. First of all, the level of investments that are required, and given the fact that we assume that there is an easing of the financing of these investments, the higher the investments, the more beneficial the effects. But also the energy saving expenditures that are associated with the implementation of these bottom-up policies that are considered in the Fit for 55 scenario. So considering energy saving that takes place in buildings or the industry, there we see that energy efficiency measures are strongly linked with, again, domestically produced labor-intensive activities like construction. Similarly, when it comes to dependence on coal or other fossil fuel-related activities, we see that the member states with the highest dependence are those that will be affected more negatively as expected. And also export intensity is a key driver, and the manufacturing potential of clean energy equipment, as well as the renewable energy potential. So we see, for example, some countries like Spain, for example, that produces wind turbines, may benefit from the transition towards 2050 when compared to other countries that are dependent on fossil fuel activities at the moment and do not have the manufacturing potential for these emerging technologies. Will continue to see losses throughout the period. Now, when comparing the net zero with the net zero just transition funds, we find that really the resources of the just transition fund generate only a very small positive effect in the economy at the national level. And this is given to the magnitude of the just transition fund that is indeed very small when compared to the national GDP. So effects are expected to be positive, but small. However, we highlight here that in this analysis, we have only considered the direct effects from the demand of goods, or the multiplier effect to the economy for the just transition fund measures, and not any growth-inducing effects that can be anticipated from productivity gains associated to digitalization or labor skill reorientation and lifelong education. So we only cover, let's say, the direct effect of the Just Transition Fund and not what is expected to be growth-inducing. Now, going at the subnational level, here we see that the impacts are more intense at the regional level, as expected. And we see, for example, some high employment losses in Bulgarian regions, as expected, most notably so in regions with coal mines or regions with low economic development. But we also see some employment gains for example, in Hungary due to the manufacturing of electric vehicle batteries, but also in Poland, in certain regions that have not been the key coal mining regions and are again part of the emerging sectors as manufacturing of electric vehicles or batteries. And as discussed, regions in Spain due to the production of wind turbines primarily. In absolute terms, of course, the highest gains are noted in the metropolitan areas, where the highest economic activity takes place. And these are the areas that provide construction and other types of services to the rest of the regions in order for the investments to take place, both for the power supply, but also for investments for the manufacturing of clean technologies, etc. While the largest losses are still in carbon-intensive regions that have low renewable energy potential and poor economic diversification. So, focusing on the Just Transition Fund, we see that the introduction of the Just Transition Fund only partly compensates the macroeconomic losses faced by the EU regions, and none of the regions that we see that will be negatively affected by the transition are seen to gain because of the introduction of the Just Transition Fund. So Just Transition Funds are not enough to remove, let's say, the costs of the transition. On average, most vulnerable EU regions receive a support of approximately 0.1% of their GDP up to 2030. And as expected, the regions with a higher, let's say, intensity of the Just Transition Fund in Greece and Czech Republic record the highest gains in terms of total output and gross value added. In this map, we show the changes in labor income at the regional level for regions that receive the Just Transition Fund when compared to the net zero scenario. So when compared to a net zero scenario without a Just Transition Fund. Now, we see that when it comes to the multiplier effect, the highest potential is for measures related to the workforce transition, given that this generates demand for labor-intensive economic activities with domestic value chain components, so that in order to actually implement these measures, the regions do not have to import technology. While the lowest are for those with low domestic component, like investments in PV plants, smart grids, etc. The benefits of, from the implementation of the Just Transition Fund measures spread also to neighboring regions, as demand for goods and services cannot be just satisfied entirely from the intra-regional resources. And we see that this demand can actually be met from neighboring regions, creating positive externalities also to the metropolitan regions as discussed. And again, we highlight that the longer term benefits linked to productivity and other gains from the Just Transition Fund are not assessed in this analysis. So thanks a lot, and yeah, looking forward to our discussion and any questions.
Thank you very much, Zoi. And if anybody has a question, please feel free to ask it, or you can write it in the chat. Meanwhile, I can also start with a couple of questions. I'll give the audience a few minutes. So Zoe, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the dynamics on the assumptions of the GME3 model and regarding the labor market dynamics and substitution effects across sectors. Are there any assumptions made on sort of employment moving from one sector to the other, and then sort of what are these and how do they also relate to the results?
Yes, thanks. So this is a very relevant question because indeed results are very much driven by our assumptions on how labor, but also capital moves across regions or sectors. So in these scenario versions, we have assumed that there is no mobility of capital or labor across countries. But there is mobility across sectors. Now, for labor, I identify different occupation types within the GME3 model. So, in essence, mobility is only allowed across these occupational types. So we have 5 occupations at the moment, developing. We're now developing the model to include more details on this, which means that, for example, managers or skilled workers, etc., we can see movement across sectors within this occupational type. This has implications when assuming that this mobility is frictionless. This has implications, of course, to the cost of the transition that we assess. So in essence, when we see that a coal power plant, for example, or coal mining closes, we can assume that workers of the same skills can then move to other sectors if there is demand for them.
Thank you. And related to that, because one of the assumptions, if I correct me if I'm wrong, was that also investments, at least for some of the results, that investments should not crowd out current investments. And maybe from a policy perspective, do you have any recommendations on how this might be achieved or how we can get closer to that?
Yeah, thanks. So again, I mean, this is an important driver of our results. In terms of policy implications, in essence, this means that we assume that there is access to cheap financing and that there is no reason to cancel out other types of investments in order to perform these additional investment requirements. This has this growth generating effect in the sense that in the longer term, we see that, of course, this additional capital stock that's generated through the investments actually gives a boost to the economic performance. But in the short term, it could even have an inflationary effect if demand for investment goods increases prices.
And maybe I missed it, but did your analysis capture the impacts of the energy crisis? And if not, then how do you think this might also impact your results?
Yes, the effects of the energy crisis are not explicitly considered here because we start from the reference scenario of the European Commission as of 2020. We expect the new one to be released in 2025. But let's say this is the most recent, but yet outdated, that is out there to be considered.
And then in terms of sort of going back to the broader picture of Adjust, one of your findings was that the Just Transition Fund only partly compensates losses in some regions. Do you have any further policy recommendations on potentially how to either fully compensate or also maybe compensate those that are the most impacted in these regions?
Yeah, not really. We have not investigated much in this, but we see that indeed, I mean, the Just Transition Fund is not substantial to address the effects. Now, if we would consider also this effects of on productivity growth, assuming that indeed the Just Transition Fund is properly implemented and effective, this could change, I guess, but more at the longer term.
And I'm curious about what you said about the occupational groups that you use. So could you speak a little bit more about what these are and sort of which way they're impacted?
So the five occupational groups that we assume are it's really the managers, technicians, low skill agriculture workers, and clerks or shop assistants or similar. So in essence, each of the economic sectors has a demand for specific types of occupations. So we identify the labor intensity by occupation for the production of each of our sectors. And we do have a module that allows for endogenous human capital development, in the sense that households may decide to take education or training, so leave the labor market for a few years, get education in order to move from one occupation to the other. But this is not active in this model ones.
And very interesting work, but I wanted to ask you sort of what are your next avenues for future academic research regarding this, or where are the, let's say, directions that you also want to take based on the results that you got from this?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, what we're doing is that we're trying to also increase the number of occupations, not only for the EU, but also for the rest of the countries, and to be able to understand in more detail the employment implications of the transition, assuming that this higher granularity will increase also the friction, but to a reasonable level. And one of our next steps is to assess scenarios that are more up to date with regards to the reference policies, but also to understand what are the competitiveness implications of policies such as the CBAM. So going beyond the assessment of the Fit for 55 net zero target, and including also specific policies.
Very interesting. And let's see if there's any questions from the audience. Please feel free to raise your hand, or there's no one on the chat. But if not, then I think we can start to wrap it up a bit earlier. Maybe I'll take the opportunity to announce the next Adjust webinar will take place on the 19th of December from 3 to 4. So mark your calendar. And yeah, otherwise, Zoe, I don't know if you want to add anything else, but otherwise, I thank you for the very, very interesting and great work, and looking forward to seeing how the developments go.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Bye-bye. Bye.